As 1812 comes to an end, Emperor of the French Napoleon Bonaparte is faced with a colossal challenge. He's just suffered a devastating defeat in Russia. His Grande Armée lost some 500,000 men and 175,000 horses in just 6 months, and his best remaining troops are mostly tied down in a grinding war in Spain. Now, he has to find a way to rebuild the army to maintain his hold on most of Europe. But military defeat changes the political balance. Napoleon's control of the continent depends on his alliances with the satellite German states of the Confederation of the Rhine and those he forced on defeated former enemies Prussia and Austria. And he firmly believes that he can restore his fortunes on the battlefield. Russia is also facing a challenge after its victory in the Patriotic War of 1812. Some influential figures like Grand Prince Konstantin favor stopping at Russia's borders since Napoleon is unlikely to invade Russia again. They argue that if Russia weakens France too much, Britain will benefit along with ungrateful former Russian allies, Prussia and Austria. The Tsar and State Secretary Karl von Nesselrode believe that Napoleon will remain a danger for Russia. The Tsar insists that Europe must be liberated, which will also increase Russia's influence in creating a new order. Having successfully secured the safety of my empire, I can turn to the great goal of liberating Europe. Never before has there been an opportunity for liberation like those that are being created now due to the total destruction of the French army. After a decade of defeats at the hands of Napoleon, many educated Russians see the victory of 1812 as a chance to grow Russian prestige in Europe, and they support the Tsar. In the Austrian Empire and the many German-speaking states to its north, the political sands are also shifting now that France has been weakened. Many in Austria and Prussia want to throw off the forced alliance with France and regain the territories they lost at the hands of Napoleon in years past. Events in Prussia take a dramatic turn even as their army retreats from Russia alongside the French. Prussian General Ludwig Yorck and Russian Empire General Hans Karl von Diebitsch signed the Convention of Tauroggen and negotiate a deal for Prussian forces in the east on December 30th, 1812, which commits the Prussian corps that invaded Russia alongside Napoleon to neutrality. But Yorck is acting without the permission of Prussian King Friedrich Wilhelm. The king is under pressure from Prussians who want to join the Russian, British and Swedish alliance against France, but he's afraid of the potential consequences of switching sides. Yorck explains his actions in a letter to his king. I eagerly await a word from your majesty whether I shall advance against the real enemy or whether political circumstances require your majesty to condemn me. I will accept either outcome with faithful devotion. And I swear to your majesty that whether facing the firing squad or on the battlefield where I have grown old and gray, I await the bullet with equal calm. The king still hesitates to leave the alliance with Napoleon, but with pressure building from his generals and from patriotic Prussians who wanted to, in their view, free all of the German lands from French domination, he finally agrees. At the end of February, Prussia changes sides and allies itself with Russia at the Convention of Kalisz. The anti-Napoleonic alliance now includes Russia, Prussia, Britain, Sweden, Portugal, and the Spanish rebels. At first, the Kalisz Agreement remains a secret due to Prussia's fear of France, but it calls for Prussia to be restored to its pre-1806 borders, with some gains for Russia in the Polish lands, and for Prussia to field an army of 80,000 men alongside 150,000 troops from Russia. Prussia finally officially joins the war against France in March, and the king issues a dramatic statement to his subjects, one of the first times a Prussian monarch addresses the public in such a way. Brandenburgers, Prussians, Silesians, Pomeranians, Lithuanians, you know what you have borne for the past 7 years. You know the sad fate that awaits you if we do not bring this war to an honorable end. Whatever sacrifices may be required of us as individuals, they will be outweighed by the sacred rights for which we make them, and for which we must fight to a victorious end unless we are willing to cease to be Prussians or Germans. This is the final decisive struggle. Upon it depends our independence, our prosperity, our existence. The entry of Prussia into the war is considered by many in Germany as the beginning of what have been called the Befreiungskriege, the Wars of Liberation. Some German patriots want to call the new phase of the war the Freedom War, but the king feels this might give his subjects some troublesome ideas beyond the defeat of the French. The conflict is also known as the War of the Sixth Coalition. Other German kings and princes of the Confederation of the Rhine stay loyal to Napoleon, often to preserve their own position in spite of the patriotic feelings of many of their subjects. Grand Duke Karl August von Weimar sums up his own fears. "We small kings will need all our wits and caution to remain calm, non-partisan, and loyal to Napoleon, lest we also fall." Austria also wants to get out of its alliance with France, but Emperor Franz II and Foreign Minister Count Metternich are cautious. For one thing, they don't want to encourage German patriotic uprisings, as they might spread to their own empire as well. They strike a secret deal with the Russians so that the Austrian corps serving until now with the French is allowed to withdraw from Warsaw south into Austrian Galicia rather than west as Napoleon intended. The Austrians then propose that they act as mediators between the Russians and the French, and this is a way to position Austria as neutral. So, Prussia has joined Russia against France, Austria is hedging its bets, and the German lands are on the brink of popular rebellion. And while the diplomats are feverishly sending messages and arguing late into the candlelit nights of Europe, the Russian army is marching west. Russian Field Marshal Mikhail Kutuzov wants to be very careful with his army, but the Tsar pressures him to advance, which he does, but with no hurry. Russian troops take Königsberg January 6th, then they besiege Thorn and take Warsaw on February 7th. French-led troops under Viceroy of Italy Eugène de Beauharnais are still too weak to oppose the Russians in open battle, so they withdraw westwards across the frozen Oder River. Though Napoleon is not happy and would have preferred them to make a stand. All that is left of Napoleon's once vast zone of control in the east are isolated and besieged French garrisons. In Prussia, Russian officer Gavril Meshetich notes the reaction of the population to the arrival of Russian forces. The people greeted the Russians with joyful faces, began to consider them their friends and liberators from the French troops. They cried, "Long live Alexander," and joined all their forces with the Russian troops. Kutuzov doesn't want to send the army too far, but the Tsar urges him on. Napoleon is still in Paris, so Alexander hopes that he can gain as much territory as possible while Napoleon is far away to encourage Austria to join the Russian alliance. As they had done in 1812, the Russians create flying Cossack columns of several thousand horsemen who penetrate beyond and between French positions. The French-led troops are too few and lack cavalry to stop these raids behind their lines, and the Cossacks are able to wreak havoc on French communications and supply. They even occupy Hamburg for a time and tie down an entire French corps. Once the alliance between Russia and Prussia is signed in late February, the pace of operations picks up. The Russians enter Berlin without a fight on March 4th and Leipzig on April 3rd. Kutuzov decides to concentrate his main army around Dresden before the coming reckoning with Napoleon's fresh armies, which are on their way east. The field marshal, however, receives a wound and dies on April 28th from the resulting infection. The Tsar therefore replaces him with General Pyotr Wittgenstein. So, as the armies maneuver across Central Europe, both sides know that much larger forces are needed for the coming battles, and both sides have been raising fresh troops after the bloodletting of 1812. Despite France's losses in Russia, many leading Frenchmen still believe in the Emperor's legendary abilities as a battlefield commander. France has lost a major campaign in Russia, but the Empire still has many resources. They can draw on new units from satellite states like the Confederation of the Rhine and the Kingdoms of Italy and Naples, but even France's own manpower reserves are not yet exhausted. Before the Russian campaign even comes to an end, the French government already calls up new conscripts and searches for new sources of draft horses and mounts for the cavalry. General and diplomat Armand de Caulaincourt is hopeful. France was one vast workshop. The entire French nation overlooked Napoleon's reverses and vied with one another in displaying zeal and devotion. It was as glorious an example of the French character as it was a personal triumph for the emperor, who, with amazing energy, directed all the resources of which his genius was capable into organizing and guiding the great national endeavor. Things seemed to come into existence as if by magic. Not all Frenchmen are as enthusiastic, and the rebuilding of the army sees mixed success. Napoleon is able to raise large numbers of new troops fairly quickly by calling up the draft classes of 1813 and 1814 early. He also drafts National Guardsmen and gendarmes, transfers some Navy sailors to the army, and draws on the reserves of units in Spain. But quantity is not quality. Even Napoleon believer Caulaincourt is disheartened with the reality of the army, though he does exaggerate when he says it is, quote, an organized mob. It is better than that, but it's very inexperienced and poorly trained, and a far cry from the army that marched into Russia in 1812. In theory, the infantry can be trained reasonably quickly, but there's not enough time to properly train new cavalrymen and not enough horses to replace those lost in Russia. The Russian army, on the other hand, is victorious in 1812, but it suffers such severe losses that it's badly depleted. This is why Kutuzov wants to be so careful when advancing west, and it takes time for new recruits to be trained and reinforcements to be brought from the vast reaches of the empire to fill out the ranks. The Prussians are also busy expanding their army in early 1813, which includes not only conventional units, but also takes advantage of the wave of patriotism sweeping the German-speaking lands for the Liberation War. Many young volunteers, especially students and other educated urbanites, joined the Freikorps, mostly irregular units who also operate alongside regular troops. One of the most famous Prussian Freikorps is commanded by Ludwig Adolf Wilhelm Freiherr von Lützow, which is incorporated into the regular Prussian army. One of its most famous volunteers is Eleonore Prohaska, a woman who enlists under a man's name. Young Jewish German Löser Cohen of Mecklenburg-Schwerin decides to volunteer as well. Cohen's patriotism is strengthened when Duke Friedrich announces emancipation for the Jews, and he joins a light infantry Jäger unit. I presented myself to my beloved parents with the words, "The time is now come where we Jews have the opportunity to loyally serve the fatherland." His training left no doubt about the enemy. Target practice was in the afternoon. Our targets were rectangular with a portrait of Napoleon on them. We shot at him, and whoever hit the heart was cheered 3 times. We had a lot of fun shooting. Prussia also calls up older officers and activates the Landsturm, a defensive militia for all men aged 15 to 60. By April, the Allied Russians and Prussians have about 100,000 men in the field, while Napoleon commands 200,000. The freshly raised Allied and French-led armies now clash in the first major battle of the 1813 campaign near the town of Lützen on May 2nd. Napoleon has joined his army and is now moving with it towards Leipzig, but he does not expect a battle on his southern flank, which is under the command of Marshal Ney. Bonaparte orders Ney to send out reconnaissance parties to locate the enemy, but the Marshal ignores the order. The Allied Russian and Prussian army, on the other hand, used their superior and more numerous light cavalry to get a much more accurate picture of where the French-led army is located, although they underestimate its strength. Wittgenstein decides to concentrate on Ney's corps, but the attack is delayed until May 2nd because of confused night marches to deploy the Prussian and Russian forces. About midday, Prussian cavalry under General Gebhard Blücher attack Marshal Ney's corps and are surprised to discover it's larger than they thought. Both sides quickly rush reinforcements to this part of the line, but it's Napoleon who gains a numerical advantage. Still, the Allied troops manage to push the French-led forces back. Blücher is wounded and hands over command to General York. The Emperor arrives on the battlefield in mid-afternoon, just as Ney's exhausted corps is giving way under the weight of the Allied attack, and Napoleon rides back and forth to encourage the conscripts to fight on. According to General Marmont, this is one of Napoleon's finest moments as a leader. This was probably the day of his whole career on which Napoleon incurred the greatest personal danger on the field of battle. He exposed himself constantly, leading the defeated men of Third Corps back to the charge. Slowly, Napoleon is able to bring up more and more troops who stop the Allied advance. The critical point of the battle rages back and forth near the village of Kaya, where the French managed to stop the Allied advance with concentrated artillery fire from a Grande Batterie of 70 guns. The diarist of a Prussian Guard Jäger battalion describes the battlefield between two of the villages. The field between Klein and Grossbeeren resembled a bivouac where whole battalions had lain down. To make matters worse for the Allies, who think they're winning until they start to run into trouble at Kaya, other French corps are approaching from both flanks, which puts the Allied army in danger. Napoleon sends in the Imperial Guard at the critical moment in late afternoon, and despite a desperate uphill Prussian cavalry charge, they throw back the Russians and Prussians to their original positions. French-led forces then push the Prussians out of Leipzig, creating an extreme threat of encirclement. The Tsar has been holding back reserves so he could personally send them in at the dramatic moment to turn the tide, but now it's too late. Wittgenstein asks the Tsar and the King for permission to retreat, which they grant. The Allied force withdraws towards Dresden. The Battle of Lützen is a French victory, even though they lose 15 to 20,000 killed and wounded to the Allies' 10 to 15,000. French officer Jean Coignet recalls the scene after the fighting is over. Near Lützen, I saw many young men and women who carried the wounded, regardless of their nation, into the city. And they returned again and again to bring back new victims of the fighting. One of the wounded on the coalition side is General Gerhard von Scharnhorst, whose minor foot injury becomes fatally infected on the retreat. So Napoleon has won an important victory at Lützen, and the coalition is in retreat. But the Emperor has failed to destroy the Allied army and could not pursue them because he does not have enough cavalry. The weakened but determined Prussians and Russians now prepare for a new defensive stand. After the coalition is defeated at Lützen, their morale is low. Napoleon has worked his magic again, and Allied command and control in combat does not inspire confidence. As they retreat east towards better defensive positions, General Gneisenau writes to his wife about the mood. "We have abandoned the Elbe River unnecessarily. The soldier is discontent with the constant retreat, and I cannot blame him for this. Should we deliver a new battle and lose, the rumor of it will reach you quickly enough. In the meantime, do not be concerned. The fate of arms is sometimes quite odd, but what I know comes from the spirit of the soldier, which provides great hope. He is full of fortitude. It is lively in the camp before us. Music and singing ring forth, and everyone is cheerful, because the retreat has stopped." Despite the new joint Allied headquarters created on May 10th, Allied commanders argue about what to do, but they eventually decide to select a strong defensive position around Bautzen, just east of Dresden, to make their stand. General von Bülow's army at Magdeburg is assigned the task of protecting Berlin. Meanwhile, Napoleon sends most of his army to pursue the coalition army eastwards. Marshal Ney, however, moves towards Berlin to threaten the capital and join forces with the Saxons. The Emperor also hopes that this force will put pressure on the Prussians to protect their capital and split them from the Russians. Some historians even argue that Napoleon still hopes to get back to his original plan of sweeping through northern Prussia to Danzig and beyond in a grand encirclement. Regardless, the Emperor of the French recognizes that the enemy he's just defeated at Lützen is far more capable than the Prussian and Russian forces that he easily crushed back in 1805 and 1806. These animals have learned something. This newfound respect of sorts for his enemies might also motivate the Emperor on the diplomatic front. He hopes that his main army operating so close to the border with Austria might sway the Austrians to join him again, and he sends Caulaincourt to visit the Tsar with an offer for a ceasefire. Napoleon is not serious about peace, but he hopes that the possibility might confuse the coalition and prevent Austria from joining them. When Napoleon's army reaches Bautzen, he tries to put his battle plan into action. The main force would fix the Allies in a pitched battle, while Marshal Ney would march around them and attack the coalition positions from the north. This would cut off the Russo-Prussian force and allow the French-led army to finally catch and destroy them. The battle begins on May 20th, and at first all goes well for Napoleon. He crosses the river Spree at several places, and after a difficult battle, his 122,000 men are able to push back the thinly spread out 90,000 Allied forces and capture the town of Bautzen. The next day, Napoleon attacks again, but he does not want to commit his valuable reserves until the crucial moment, when Ney has swept in from the north and cut off the Allied retreat. Still, the fighting on the ground is intense for those caught up in it, like Prussian cavalry officer von Hüse. I was alone on a hill in the midst of a hail of bullets and tried to mount my horse, which was spooked by the sound of the guns. Suddenly, I was lying on the ground, without at first knowing why I had fallen. I instinctively looked to my lame foot and was greeted by the gloomy sight of my foot lying next to me, split in half by a shell. While Allied troops try to hold on, the Allied command thinks that Ney is still on the road to Berlin. Ney is supposed to take them in the flank, but he doesn't arrive on time at Bautzen since he doesn't fully understand his very brief orders from Napoleon, and instead wastes precious time and men assaulting a village he should simply bypass. Staff officer Antoine Jomini and Ney have a heated discussion in which the Marshal makes his priority clear. I don't understand a thing about your damned strategy. I just know I don't turn my back to the cannons. The dogged defense put up by fresh Russian units under Barclay de Tolly, who joined the army after Lützen, also plays a role. One of the Russian wounded is Count Osterman Tolstoy, whose injury is later described by Major Mikhail Petrov in his theatrically patriotic memoirs. Osterman Tolstoy rode in front of his troops under the most dangerous fire and in skirmishes, dragging everyone to victory and the destruction of the enemy. And when the bullet dug deep into his chest near his left shoulder, he, with a bloodied white vest, seemed unscathed and unaware about his wound due to the heat of his heroic aspiration, which brought into everyone trust in victory, until he fell from his warhorse because of the loss of blood. The communication difficulties between Napoleon and Ney, Ney's stubborn attacks on a less than critical objective, and Russian tenacity give Wittgenstein the time he needs to organize a retreat across the river Lebau and avoid the dreaded encirclement. That is not to say that Allied perform commands particularly well. The Prussian king and General Blücher don't communicate effectively, and neither do the Tsar and Wittgenstein. Some historians have argued that the coalition makes a mistake by accepting battle at Bautzen instead of waiting for more reinforcements. The French and their allies once again defeat the coalition army, but cannot destroy it. Just like after Lützen, Napoleon does not have enough cavalry to pursue his beaten enemy on a vulnerable retreat. Napoleon's unfinished victory at Bautzen is bloody. He loses about 18,000 killed and wounded, while the coalition forces only lose about 12,000. The realities of the war are far more mundane than Petrov's prose or the Prussian account that compared their soldiers to Spartans. This latest Allied defeat causes the Tsar to replace Wittgenstein with Barclay de Tolly, Napoleon's old nemesis from the Russian campaign. Marshal Ney offers to resign, but the Emperor refuses. The campaign in the spring of 1813 sees Prussia join the Sixth Coalition against Napoleon, the Russian army cross its western border, and the start of a German patriotic uprising against French domination. But for all the hopes of the Allies, Napoleon has shown flashes of his old brilliance. His victories at Lützen and Bautzen, though, are incomplete, and he's unable to finish off the enemy army in dramatic fashion as he did in years past. Napoleon has an army, but it is not the army of Austerlitz or Jena. The Emperor is still confident that he can win, but the forces opposing him are growing stronger and stronger, and the Tsar is still bent on breaking French power. For German people living in the regions affected by the fighting, the plans of princes are far removed from the hardships of daily life. Saxon Karl Gottfried expresses his fears even as the war begins. I do not deny that my courage, which I've maintained for a long time, longer than most, has started to leave me. It is a sad life to have to fear for one's existence every 3 or 4 years. The Austrians, who are still French allies on paper but are hedging their bets in practice, broker a tense summer armistice. The Allies want Austria to switch sides and join them, which would tip the balance of power in their favor. In the French-dominated German Confederation of the Rhine, the ruling classes continue to support Napoleon's war effort with troops and supplies, while some of their subjects dream instead of an independent and united Germany, another threat to French dominance. While peace talks take place in Prague, Russian diplomat Karl von Nesselrode meets in secret with the Austrians. Prince Schwarzenberg, Marshal Radetzky, and Prince Metternich favor joining the coalition, but Kaiser Franz insists on a peace offer. Napoleon rejects the Austrian terms since he still believes that he can turn the tide on the battlefield and keep control of the Confederation of the Rhine. The Emperor speaks frankly to Prince Metternich. Your rulers, born on the throne, can be defeated 20 times and can simply return to their residences. This I cannot do. My rule will not outlast the day when I have ceased to be strong and feared. Soon after this, Austria declares war on France and joins the Sixth Coalition. In Napoleon's own words, all of Europe was marching against him now. The summer 1813 truce comes to an end on August 10th, and soon armies are on the march from Berlin to Bohemia, with the fate of Napoleonic Europe hanging in the balance. The French-led armies have been brought up to strength, but many are new and poorly trained recruits. The cavalry proves much harder to rebuild after its destruction in Russia, and Napoleon is desperately short of horse. Even so, he commands 400,000 Frenchmen, Poles, Italians, Germans, and others, and he still has an experienced corps of commanders and veterans. The French also have the advantage of interior lines of communication and a single unified command. The Allied armies have more experienced troops, but their ranks are also filled with inexperienced men. Most Russian infantrymen have seen little action, and the Prussian Landwehr militia is enthusiastic but unproven. What the coalition forces do not lack, however, is cavalry, both light and heavy, which gives them a powerful advantage in reconnaissance and pursuit. Their artillery officer corps is not as skilled as the French, but they have many more guns. In all, the coalition has about 500,000 men in the field. The Allied chain of command, though, is disorganized. In theory, Austrian Prince Karl von Schwarzenberg is in overall command, but Russian General Barclay de Tolly retains command of Russian forces. The presence of Kaiser Franz, Tsar Alexander, King Friedrich Wilhelm, and the Crown Prince of Sweden in the field will also complicate matters. In July, the Allies adopt a common war plan at Trachenberg. The Allies may have the advantage in men and materiel, but after their defeats in the spring, they retain a healthy respect for Bonaparte's generalship. The Trachenberg plan is in line with the advice of Tsar Alexander's new advisor and former French general under Napoleon, Jean-Victor Moreau. Avoid engagements with troops led personally by Napoleon, and try to beat his marshals when their corps are scattered throughout the theatre of war. Only fight against Bonaparte with a considerable preponderance of forces. Once the marshal's forces have been worn down, the coalition armies would unite to face the emperor himself. Despite the Allied plans, it is the French who strike first. Napoleon targets the Allied northern army defending Berlin, under the command of the Swedish Crown Prince Karl Johann, who formerly served Napoleon as Marshal Bernadotte. If the French can threaten the Prussian capital, they might cause a split between the Prussians and the Russians. Marshal Oudinot advances on the Prussian capital with his optimistically named Army of Berlin. French troops struggle through the forests and marshes and do not carry out proper reconnaissance, but the Swedish Crown Prince still suggests a retreat. His Prussian subordinate general, Friedrich von Bülow, refuses to give up the capital without a fight. Unsere Knochen sollen vor Berlin bleichen, nicht rückwärts. Our bones should bleach in front of Berlin, not behind it. On August 23rd, the two armies meet at Grossbeeren. Marshal Régnier rushes his French and Saxon corps into an attack, but after hard fighting, Prussian and Swedish troops carry the day, and Oudinot cannot recover the situation. The French pull back from Berlin for now, and Karl Johann decides not to pursue them, much to the frustration of the Prussians. In Silesia, no one is holding back Prussian General Gebhard von Blücher's Army of Silesia, which starts operations before the truce has even officially expired. On August 20th, they run into Napoleon's main army and withdraw to avoid combat. The Grande Armée gives chase, and over 3 days of a fighting retreat, the Prussian militia begins to crack. A few thousand even desert. Suddenly, on August 23rd, Napoleon turns around and moves west to deal with an Allied threat elsewhere. Marshal MacDonald takes command of the remaining French-led forces, named the Army of the Bobar, and advances towards the Katzbach River. On the 26th, the two armies collide in a torrential rainstorm at the Battle of the Katzbach. As at Grossbeeren, French commanders bungle the approach, and one corps does not make it across the river in time for the battle. Allied command and control also struggles, as Russian Army General Alexandre de Langeron thinks that he's covering a retreat when Blücher's plan is to in fact attack. At first the French push the Russians back, but then the Prussians smash the French facing them on the Allied right. Russian cavalry then finds the French flank exposed by the missing units stuck on the wrong side of the river and charges in. The driving rain means that the French infantry squares can hardly fire their muskets, and there isn't enough French cavalry to save them. MacDonald orders a withdrawal, which turns into a torturous, rain-soaked retreat under constant attack from Allied cavalry. Including the week-long pursuit, the French suffer about 35,000 killed and wounded, plus an entire division made prisoner, while the Allies lose about 20,000. For General Langeron, it's just like the chaos of the Russian campaign back in 1812. The level of losses and the disorder in the enemy ranks reminded me of their disastrous flight from Moscow to the Vistula. The campaign has started badly for the French, with defeats at Grossbeeren and Katzbach. Before things get any worse, Napoleon decides to strike a decisive blow against the main Allied force, the Army of Bohemia. At the same time as the Allies were chasing MacDonald after Katzbach, Schwarzenberg's Army of Bohemia moves on Dresden. The city is defended by Marshal Saint-Cyr's corps, but they're outnumbered almost 10-1. The Allies attack because they think that Napoleon is headed north towards Berlin, but in fact he's moving towards them to catch them from behind before they can concentrate their forces. His men march 120 kilometers in just 3 days, but for the French plan to work, Saint-Cyr must hold out for at least a few days. When word reaches Napoleon that the city will probably fall, the Emperor changes course and marches straight to Saint-Cyr. Meanwhile, the Allies are slow to attack. The Tsar wants to attack on August 25th, but Schwarzenberg wants to wait for more troops to arrive. The attack is postponed to the 26th, by which time Napoleon has arrived. Still, the coalition army goes against its own plan of avoiding Napoleon and tries to storm Dresden on August 26th, and they fail. Now, coalition forces are in a vulnerable position, with the mountains and narrow roads of the Erzgebirge region at their back. Napoleon attacks on August 27th, after a night of rain that turns the ground to muck. Although badly outnumbered, Marshals Murat and Victor smash Austrian Marshal Bianchi's corps on the coalition's left flank, taking an entire division prisoner. Then, Napoleon strikes the coalition again on their right. It's all too fast for Schwarzenberg's communications, and he can't react in time to the shifting blows. Allied reserves haven't even arrived when Schwarzenberg gives the order to retreat. The French lose 10,000 killed and wounded, the Allies about 15,000, along with 10,000 prisoners. Long columns of Austrians, Prussians and Russians now begin winding their way through the narrow roads of the Erzgebirge. Pamphil Nazarov of the Finland Guards, one of the very few Russian peasant soldiers to ever leave a written record of his experiences, recalls seeing the Tsar himself on the march. The emperor began to cry bitterly, and taking a white handkerchief out of his pocket, began to wipe his cheeks. Seeing this, I also began to cry. Napoleon has beaten the coalition's main army at Dresden, but his marshals have been defeated everywhere else. The emperor has the chance to catch the army of Bohemia on the run, but will he take it? As the main Allied army retreats through the difficult terrain of the Erzgebirge, they're unaware of the grave danger lurking behind them. When Napoleon rushed to save Dresden, he left behind one corps under General Dominique van Damme with orders to threaten the Allied rear. Now Van Damme's 50,000 men are moving on the vital river crossing at Königstein, defended by just 13,000 Russians under Prince Eugen von Württemberg. If they cannot hold, Van Damme might block the passes out of the Erzgebirge, trapping the army of Bohemia and the three Allied monarchs between him and Napoleon. The Russians conduct a desperate fighting retreat along the Teplitz Valley to buy time, while Eugen and General Ostermann Tolstoy argue about who is really in command. Van Damme is overconfident and doesn't think that the Russians have much fight left in them. The enemy has fought in vain against our brave troops. He's been defeated on all occasions and is in a state of complete rout. But the Russians make a stand near the town of Kulm on August 29th. At the start of the battle, the French have a 2-to-1 advantage in numbers, and in extremely bitter fighting, they're able to slowly push the Russians back. Eugen wants General Alexei Yermolov to send in the Ismailovsky Guards to turn the tide, but once again, there's an internal squabble. The prince is a German and doesn't give a damn whether the Russian Guards survive or not. But my duty is to save at least something of his guard for the emperor. Finally, General Ostermann Tolstoy intervenes and the guards enter the fight. More Russian reinforcements arrive under General Diebitsch, who orders a cavalry charge against Yermolov's wishes, and the French are driven back. The next day, disaster strikes for Van Damme, now outnumbered thanks to the Allied reinforcements. Austrian and Russian forces quickly stop a French attack and go over to the offensive, while a Prussian corps under von Kleist appears in Van Damme's rear. The hunter has become the hunted. Van Damme's corps is half destroyed, and he and 15,000 of his men surrender. Each side loses about 10,000 killed and wounded, including half of the Russian infantry in Eugen's original force. Napoleon does not lead a pursuit of the beaten allies from Dresden, and the army of Bohemia escapes the danger. There is enormous relief at the Tsar's headquarters. The Battle of Kulm changed into a cry of joy, the despair which was spreading through the valleys of Bohemia. The Allies can consider themselves lucky that they avoided a disaster at Dresden and triumphed at Kulm in spite of their command troubles. Napoleon has missed an opportunity, but he wastes no time and continues offensive operations in the north in early September. Here again, the Allies are busy arguing. The Swedish Crown Prince does not move his army south after the victory at Grossbeeren on August 23rd, and Prussian commander von Bülow is livid. Marshal Ney cuts the dispute short when his army again moves on Berlin, and the two forces meet at Dennewitz on September 6th. The French attack the Prussian side of the Allied line first, and this time the militia holds alongside the regulars, since they'd gained some extra fighting experience in smaller battles in the aftermath of Grossbeeren, like at Hagelberg. Karl Johann then orders the Russians to help their hard-pressed allies, but some resentful Prussians think that he reacts too slowly. As the fighting rages, Ney becomes so focused on his own corps fighting the Prussians that he orders Oudinot to move towards him, leaving Regnier's Franco-Saxon corps exposed. The Prussians and Russians then turn on Regnier's flank and carry the day, with the help of devastating Russian artillery fire. Once again, however, Karl Johann does not pursue Ney apart from cavalry on the hunt for prisoners. The French-led forces suffer 7,000 killed and wounded and 13,000 prisoners, while the Allies lose about 10,000. Napoleon's hope to threaten Berlin is now snuffed out for good, which means that Prussia continues to be a beacon for German nationalists in the French allied German states. So the Allies have put together a string of impressive victories and escaped a worst-case scenario at Dresden. Napoleon, once master of Europe, is in a bind. His enemies have superior forces, but he cannot retreat without risking his hold on his German allies. The fighting has only been going on for barely a month, and already the Allies have victories at Grossbeeren, Katzbach, Kulm and Dennewitz, and have recovered from the defeat at Dresden. The French have lost 100,000 men and 200 guns, while the larger coalition armies have lost 85,000 men and just 50 guns, and they have ample reserves on the way from the east. Napoleon still wants to fight, but it's the Allies who have the initiative. In September, he briefly advances on the army of Bohemia, but Schwarzenberg refuses battle. The Emperor's only realistic chance is to wait for the Allies to come to him and trust his own generalship to turn the tide. Diplomatically, Napoleon is on the back foot as well. Prince Metternich is in secret negotiations with the German states of the Confederation of the Rhine, whose leaders are now willing to consider changing sides. But it will take a major Allied victory to convince the hesitant German princes to join the coalition. Although many patriotic Germans have joined the Prussian army or formed irregular militias to oppose the French, there's been no effective mass popular uprising against French control, so the German princes must tread carefully. The Allies also want to attack, but they face a strategic dilemma as well. To get the army of Bohemia across the tricky Erzgebirge again, they'd have to detach troops to cover Dresden, and this would weaken the main force. The solution, after much inter-allied wrangling, was for Russian Army General Ludwig Bennigsen's 60,000-strong army of Poland, which has already reached Silesia, to move into Bohemia to support Schwarzenberg. Blücher's army would also cross the Elbe and link up with the Swedish Crown Prince coming south. For Allied officers like Russian Army Quartermaster General K.F. Toll, all roads lead to Saxony. It was decided that after anticipated successes, a suitable battlefield near Leipzig will serve as a place to assemble the Allied armies to fight the final battle against Napoleon. While the armies marched, Allied cavalry starts raiding the French rear, forcing Napoleon to use large units of up to several thousand men to protect his supply columns. Russian horsemen even briefly capture Kassel. The preparations come to an end in mid-October, as the armies of Bohemia and Silesia move into Saxony to face the Grande Armée. Napoleon hopes to isolate and defeat Blücher or the Crown Prince, who's moving his army south, but before he can move his forces into position, he runs out of time. The threat from the army of Bohemia cannot be ignored, so the Grande Armée concentrates at Leipzig for the supreme battle. To give the Grande Armée more time to deploy, Marshal Murat attacks Russian General Wittgenstein's units on the 14th at Liebert-Wolkwitz, and the two sides fight to a bloody draw. On the 15th, Prince Schwarzenberg writes to his wife on the eve of battle. What a solemn moment. The world rests on my shoulders. May a just God give me the strength not to succumb. French artillery officer Major Noël is also somber as he watches the infantry. Our men need rest. In Napoleon's hands, our soldiers are mere pawns he moves around the checkerboard of Europe. But these pawns given to him by an exhausted France are not the pawns of Austerlitz. They cannot stand the abrupt and continuous movements this powerful hand forces upon them. Hundreds of thousands of men and horses are converging on Leipzig. Napoleon will have to defeat superior forces if he wants to preserve his empire, as he has done in years past. For the Allies, the coming battle is a chance to remake the political order in Europe. The Battle of Leipzig begins on October 16, 1813. Allied leaders argued before settling on a plan to encircle the French army. The army of Bohemia approaches from the south, while the army of Silesia arrives from the north, and the army of the north, still not close enough to fight, approaches from the northeast. Napoleon knows that the other Allied armies will soon arrive, so he decides to concentrate his forces in the south to gain a temporary advantage in numbers while he still can. The French try to outflank the Allied position near Liebert-Volkwitz, but General Matvei Platov's Cossacks and other Allied troops are able to stop them. The main French attack focuses on the village of Wachau, which the Russians have also chosen as their point of advance. Ferocious fighting over the village and nearby high ground ensues, a hallmark of the entire battle, in which village after village will be fought over and destroyed. Wachau changes hands 3 times on this day. The French attack is supported by the firepower of a Grande Batterie of 150 guns, an experience which shakes French Lieutenant Martin. The artillery fire was terribly powerful, which I could not have previously imagined. I remember the unbearable roar of the 12-pounders in our midst. I remained deaf for several hours. Napoleon follows up the infantry and artillery assault with a devastating charge of 10,000 horsemen under Marshal Murat. The French break through and drive towards the spot from which the 3 Allied monarchs are observing the battle. Russian officer K.N. Batushkov recalls the tension. To the right, to the left, everyone was crushed. Only the grenadiers fought steadily. General Raevski stood gloomy and speechless. Things were not going very well. Moments later, Raevski is wounded, but just in time, Austrian and Russian cavalry arrives to plug the gap, including the Cossacks of the Guard from the Tsar's personal retinue. The Allies avert a crisis in the south, partly because of the timely arrival of Blücher in the north. The Prussian reaches the battlefield more quickly than Napoleon expects, and Marshal Marmont has to head north to meet the new threat, though he and Marshal Ney cannot prevent the Prussians from taking Möckern. Another point of concern for the French on the first day is Austrian General Gyulai's attack west of Leipzig at Lindenau, which threatens the Grande Armée's only potential route out of Leipzig in case of defeat. But here, the French hold fast. The Austrians and Prussians, however, do manage to take Dölitz and Markkleeberg after these villages change hands several times. By the end of the day, Napoleon has severely tested the army of Bohemia and even captured Austrian General Maximilian von Merfeld. But the Allied lines have held and reinforcements have arrived. On this day alone, 25,000 Grande Armée soldiers are killed or wounded, as are 30,000 coalition troops. Napoleon makes Polish Prince Poniatowski a Marshal of France for his efforts against the Austrians. October 17th brings a pause to major fighting, though in a local action the Russians take Golis from a Polish unit. The most important event of the day is when reinforcements arrive for both sides. 14,000 French soldiers join the Grande Armée from the northeast, but the Allies receive 10 times as many. Karl Johann's army of the north, Bennigsen's army of Poland, and an Austrian corps all swell the ranks of the massive coalition army that nearly surrounds Leipzig. The Allies now outnumber the French with 335,000 men to 190,000. Napoleon knows that the situation is grave. He sends a message to Kaiser Franz and offers an armistice. The Allies, however, know that they have the advantage and reject the French terms. On October 18th, Napoleon understands that he must save what he can of the Grande Armée and plans his retreat to the west. He orders French-led troops to form up in a defensive line around the town to allow the army to cross the only bridge at Lindenau, which the entire army would have to use. He assigns a French corps to keep the route open west of the bridge as well. For the Allies, the plan is relatively simple: to put as much pressure as possible on the Grande Armée by attacking it from all sides. Barclay's Russians easily capture several villages against light resistance, since French troops have withdrawn closer to shorten the line, and Bennigsen also advances. In the north, Blücher assaults Leipzig's walls, but the French defenders hold firm and the Prussians make little progress. In the afternoon, Kleist's Prussians storm the village of Probstheide, a linchpin of the French defenses. They manage to get into the village, but cannot take it thanks to fierce French resistance from men like Philippe Balue, whose loyalty drives him on. In these difficult moments, we were more devoted to the Emperor than ever. None of our men feared death. We were so close to it in Moscow, that it doesn't scare us anymore. Napoleon is so worried he might lose the village that he sends in units of the Imperial Guard to hold it, which they're able to do against renewed assaults by the Russians, for now. The Army of the North has entered the battle, and Allied troops capture Paunsdorf with the help of a small British unit of rocketeers, making effective use of a new weapon in the form of light and mobile rocket tubes. Soon after, in an ominous sign for French political fortunes, several thousand Saxons and Württembergers surrender en masse, opening up a gap in French lines which has to be filled in haste. Coalition forces also managed to push into Schönefeld after a massive artillery duel. Napoleon realizes his only option is to retreat through Leipzig itself, and orders his remaining forces to take shelter within the city walls. Very early the next morning, the Grande Armée begins to hurry west across the bridge, just as it had done in 1812 over the Berezina. It would take time for tens of thousands of men, horses and carts to leave the town, but discipline soon begins to waver. The French command doesn't have a clear plan for the defense of the city, so units on the walls are not properly organized and led. In the midst of the confusion, the storm breaks on the defenders of Leipzig. Allied cannon begin to bombard the town, followed by an infantry assault. Leipzig resident Herr Alemann and his family take shelter at a family friend's apartment, which is soon hit. When the cannonballs crash through the roof and set the building around us on fire, we each lay in our place and prayed to God to save us, since it seemed at the moment the world was ending. The far weaker and uncertain defenders give ground, and soon there is desperate fighting in the streets. As the tension rises among the men and horses packed together, waiting for their turn to cross the bridge, disaster strikes. French engineers have placed a massive explosive charge in a boat underneath the bridge so that they can blow it, but a French soldier sets off the charge early. The bridge and all the men and horses on it is sent flying into the air. 30,000 men are trapped in the city, including dozens of high-ranking officers. Napoleon has already crossed, but Polish Prince Poniatowski has not. Already wounded, he tries to cross the river on his horse, but he drowns. He was a marshal for just 3 days. Most of the French-led forces cut off in Leipzig are made prisoner, and the rest of the Grande Armée moves west. The battle is over, but Allied cavalry now has free rein to pursue the ragged French columns and inflict as much damage as possible. Russian cavalry, including the Cossacks, plays a key role riding down whomever they can. The scenes remind Officer S.G. Chomutov of the campaign of 1812. We walked the road along which the enemy retreated, and it presented us the same spectacle as from Smolensk to Vilnius. At every step we saw the dead and dying. If it were colder, one would think that we were again in Russia. The Battle of Leipzig, the Battle of Nations, was over. In 4 days, the coalition loses about 55,000 killed and wounded, while the French and their allies lose some 45,000 killed and wounded and 35,000 prisoners. More than 500,000 men have taken the field of battle in what will remain Europe's largest battle until the First World War. Napoleon escapes with just 80,000 men, another crushing blow to the Napoleonic order that has defined Europe for a decade. His exhausted soldiers trudge westwards toward France, which is now in danger of foreign invasion. The Allied victory shakes the political order immediately. The coalition monarchs dissolve the Confederation of the Rhine and welcome some of its member states as new allies. For patriotic Germans dreaming of a united nation-state, the Battle of Nations is the culmination not of the Napoleonic Wars, but of the wars of national liberation. Decades later, a new German state will make Leipzig a centerpiece of national and imperial memory. But before he can be dethroned, Napoleon is still a potential threat, since the Emperor of the French and what remains of his Grande Armée managed to escape total destruction. And now, the Allied armies of the Sixth Coalition have to figure out how to stop him for good. The battered remains of the Grande Armée limp west towards the relative safety of Frankfurt on the Main. Once a multinational army, it's now reduced to Frenchmen, Poles and Italians after France's German allies have switched sides. Swedish Crown Prince Karl Johann takes his northern army towards French-controlled Hamburg, while Tsar Alexander and Austrian Emperor Franz accompany their armies in pursuit of Napoleon. Prussian King Friedrich Wilhelm returns to Berlin. Allied cavalry does harass the French columns, but by and large the coalition pursuit is relatively slow. There are several skirmishes and rearguard actions at Kösen, Fribourg and Höselberg, but French forces are struggling to remain a cohesive force even if the Allies aren't pressing them too hard. Their struggles are clear to Prussian officer Karl von Plotho. The roads on which the French retreated showed the most unmistakable traces of the disorganization of the enemy's army. The numbers of corpses and dead horses increased every day. Thousands of soldiers, sinking from hunger and fatigue, remained behind, unable to reach a hospital. The woods for several miles round were full of stragglers and worn out and sick soldiers. Guns and wagons were found everywhere. One reason for the slow pace is that the Allies are divided about what to do next. They had been united when it came to throwing the French out of the German states. They also agree in dissolving the French satellite Confederation of the Rhine, essentially negating French territorial gains since the Revolution of 1789. But now that the French have left Saxony, cracks begin to appear in the Sixth Coalition. Austria is worried that a full defeat of France might tip the balance of power a little too far in Russia's favor. Some Russian generals want to wait and rest their exhausted armies, but Tsar Alexander is keen to press on towards Paris. Prussian King Friedrich Wilhelm is also committed to a French defeat, but former French ally Saxony has become a bone of contention. Austria is not happy that the Russians deliver the Saxon king Friedrich August to the Prussians, as Prussian State Chancellor Karl August von Hardenberg admits. The Austrians do not take kindly to the fact that we have the King of Saxony. While the Austro-Prussian rivalry for dominance in the German lands has returned to the political scene, the main Allied armies crawl after Napoleon. Now, a new, smaller Allied army attempts to cut off the French line of retreat. Allied generals worry that Napoleon might stop at Erfurt to fight them, but he judges that his forces are too weak, so he continues westwards toward the Rhine and France. A freshly formed Austro-Bavarian force now hurries north to cut off the French line of retreat. The 43,000 troops are commanded by Bavarian General Karl von Wrede, who'd previously fought for Napoleon until Bavaria switched sides in early October. Wrede at first doesn't realize that Napoleon himself is approaching with 80,000 men and expects a much smaller French force. One faint positive for the Allies is that only about 20,000 French troops are actually combat-worthy, so they do have a numerical advantage where it counts. On October 30th, Wrede orders his troops to take up positions in front of the Hessian town of Hanau. The position is a difficult one. The river Kinzig divides the battlefield and makes maneuver or retreat more complicated, while the dense woods might provide cover for the approaching French. The Austro-Bavarians have their back to the river and the positions are connected by a vulnerable bridge. The fighting starts in the woods, where French infantry is able to clear out Austro-Bavarian resistance by midday. This allows French forces some room to implement Napoleon's plan to strike at Wrede's left. French artillery commander Antoine Drouot's men locate a hidden forest path that allows them to move up the guns in secret. Once the old guard clears the wood, the gunners set up a battery of 50 guns facing the Austro-Bavarian left. Their overwhelming fire quickly suppresses the smaller Allied battery facing them. Wrede realizes the danger and now knows that he's facing Napoleon himself. Allied cavalry charges the French guns, but volleys of grapeshot cut the German-speaking horsemen to pieces. An Austrian account describes the failed attack. Oberstleutnant von Mertens led a battalion against the wood to stop the enemy advance, but enemy cavalry appeared and launched a heavy attack. Von Mertens' horse was wounded, and the enemy cavalry reached him and inflicted 2 light saber wounds on him. He was lucky to be saved by the Royal Bavarian Chevaux Légers under the command of His Excellency von Wrede. The French cavalry then countercharges and drives the Allied horsemen from the field. Wrede's position is now critical, and Napoleon knows it. Drouot's guns pound the Allied center, while the French cavalry attack them from the open flank. French captain Jean-Roch Cognet is alone on horseback when he runs into enemy cavalry. A platoon of Bavarians rode up near me with a handsome officer at their head. Seeing I was alone, he charged me. I stopped. He came alongside and tried to stab me with his long sword. I parried the blow with my saber. I got beside him and cut off half of his head. He fell like a sack. I took his horse by the bridle and galloped off under fire from his platoon. The Austro-Bavarian troops hold out for as long as they can, but eventually give way under the pressure. As they retreat, 3 battalions are lost in the river. Wrede does try to bring in units from his right to restore the line, but after a brief success, the French drive them back across the Lamboy Bridge. The way is now free for the main French force to continue west along the road to Frankfurt, but the battle is not over. Overnight, Wrede establishes a new line south of the Kinzig, and a French artillery bombardment of the town forces the Bavarians to leave it undefended. The morning of the 31st, French units occupy the town of Hanau and watch the bridge while Napoleon and the rest of the army retreat. Allied troops attack the Lamboy Bridge but cannot take it, though they do recapture the town. During this attack, Wrede is wounded and gives up his command. French forces conduct a controlled withdrawal, and last-ditch Allied attacks across the bridge on the other side of Hanau fail. The French army's march west can no longer be stopped. The Battle of Hanau is a victory for Napoleon, since it allows him to continue his retreat towards France and preserves what little is left of his army. The Austro-Bavarian army lost about 9,000 dead and wounded in the battle and preceding skirmishes, while the French lost about 2,500, although about 10,000 sick and exhausted French troops become prisoners of war when their army moves on without them. Despite the unfavorable result for the German-speaking troops, nationalist German propagandists try to turn Hanau into a victory after the fact, since the French army does leave the battlefield and continue its overall strategic retreat. An 1814 publication compares it to an infamous French defeat in Russia and tries to show former French ally Bavaria has now changed its ways. Hanau became a second Berezina for the defeated French, and the Bavarians who had bled so often for France bloodily avenged Germany's humiliation. After reaching Frankfurt, Napoleon makes straight for Paris, but his men struggle on to Mainz, where a deadly typhus epidemic kills more than 1,000. Captain Cognet witnesses the suffering. They were struck by a yellow fever, and we found the dead strewn everywhere. I had to have men forced to load the bodies into large carts and stack them like bales of hay. The men resisted, but they were threatened with being shot. We dumped out the bodies by tipping the carts over, just like at Moscow. I had to manage this terrible task on my own, since the Emperor's cortege had already left. May such horrors never appear again. Napoleon saves what's left of his army at Hanau, but the campaign of 1813 is a terrible defeat overall, and instead of dominating Europe, he faces a fight for his own survival. Between 80 and 110,000 French troops make it to France in November 1813, but the 1813 campaign is yet another disaster for Napoleon. He's lost about 400,000 men that he simply cannot replace, and he's lost his dominant position in Europe. He no longer controls a vast alliance of client states. Austria, Prussia, and the other German states are now against him, and the Russians control Poland. Allied armies are now poised to invade the French Empire from north, east, and south. The isolated French garrisons in Central Europe surrender in November and December, freeing even more Russian troops. Meanwhile, the Pyrenees Mountains and the Rhine River become the focus of diplomatic discussions, since Austrian Foreign Minister Clemens von Metternich now sends a peace proposal to Paris, offering them as France's, quote, natural borders. Hoping to capitalize on French war weariness, the Allies prepare a manifesto for the French people, declaring that they are not making war on the French nation, rather against Napoleon. But even Metternich is skeptical. Napoleon will make no peace. Of that, I am convinced, though nothing would make me happier than to find I am mistaken. At the same time, Allied leaders are considering replacing Napoleon with Bourbon heir Louis, Count of Provence. On the other hand, the Duke of Wellington, whose Allied army has pushed the French out of Spain, is willing to consider peace with Napoleon in charge. If Bonaparte became moderate, he would probably be as good a sovereign as we could desire in France. If he did not, he would find himself engaged single-handed against an insurgent France as well as all Europe. In the end, instead of treating for peace, Napoleon is preparing to raise yet another army, as he tells Marshal Marmont in mid-November. At present, we're not ready for anything, but by the first fortnight in January, we shall be in a position to achieve a great deal. French authorities set about recruiting a new army of 150,000 soldiers, but they're running out of time and men who are fit to serve. In the south, British, Spanish and Portuguese forces have pushed the French out of Spain and enter French territory. On November 10th in southwestern France, the Duke of Wellington's 80,000 men defeat 50,000 Frenchmen under Marshal Jean de Dieu Soult at the Battle of Nivelles. Soult is pessimistic about the state of the French army. The men are fighting badly. They're no good. At the head of such troops, we shall certainly come to shameful grief. The 1813 campaign began and ended with Napoleon's French Empire in trouble. From the borders of the Russian Empire, his new Grande Armée has been smashed in Germany and driven back to the borders of his own empire. Given that he seemed to still have a fighting chance as late as his victory at Dresden in August, what went wrong? Napoleon fails in 1813 because, just like in Russia, he could not exercise effective command and control over his vast armies, which meant his marshals and generals had to act independently, and they made mistakes. He also underestimated the resolve of his enemies and the desire for freedom from French dominance in occupied lands. In the view of historian David Chandler, the Emperor of the French had waged the campaign with unrealistic expectations. Napoleon, in fact, was relying on an unlikely combination of miracles and errors to achieve his total victory. Miracles of performance and endurance on the part of his men, errors of judgment and coordination on the part of his foes. Neither lived up to his most optimistic expectations. The Allies had also made mistakes. Personal jealousies and clashing national interests had slowed their armies, as had troubles with command and control. Prussian King Friedrich Wilhelm even delayed the crossing of the Rhine against the advice of his more aggressive generals. But they'd done enough to win at Leipzig, and now their armies are superior to those of their enemy. And indeed, the war is not over, as French General Félix Giraud d'Ailin observed. We hadn't reached the end of our difficulties, and if we were about to cross back over the Rhine, it would not be long either before the Allies would be doing likewise, following hard on our heels. In the first days of 1814, German, Russian and Austrian troops under Generals Blücher and Schwarzenberg crossed the Rhine River into the heart of France. They're closer than ever to bringing about Napoleon's downfall. An interesting side note about 1813 is that Napoleon retreated through the so-called Fulda Gap. This is a geographic lowland between Frankfurt and Thuringia that allows for easier movement than the mountainous terrain around it. 150 years later, Warsaw Pact tanks would have used this route in case of an invasion of Western Europe in response to a NATO nuclear first strike during the Cold War. Nuclear deterrence on the one hand and using the atom to achieve nuclear-powered communism on the other were two primary goals of the Soviet nuclear program. And if that topic interests you, you should check out our new series Red Atoms, which covers exactly that from the first Soviet nuclear bomb to the Chernobyl disaster and beyond. And where can you watch Red Atoms? On Nebula, a streaming service we're building together with other creators. Nebula is a platform where we don't have to worry about the algorithm or advertiser guidelines, and where the viewers support us directly. This allows us to produce series like Red Atoms or our World War II series 16 Days in Berlin and Rhineland 45. And it's not just us. You can watch other creators' Nebula originals there too, like Real Engineering's Battle of Britain series. If you sign up at nebula.tv/realtimehistory, you get 40% off an annual subscription and support our channel at the same time. For just $30, you can watch Nebula originals, all our content ad-free and earlier than on YouTube, other Nebula creators, Nebula classes, and much more. That's nebula.tv/realtimehistory for 40% off and support us here at Real Time History directly. So we hope that you liked this extended video on the 1813 campaign that was so crucial for the history of Europe, especially Germany, but often gets overlooked in favor of 1812 or 1815. As usual, you can find all our sources in the video description below. If you're watching this video on Nebula or Patreon, thank you so much for your support. We couldn't do it without you. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is a production of Real Time History, the only history channel that rocks the Katzbach.